The letter arrived with a black wax seal, and Elowen Ashcombe knew before she broke it open that her family's world was about to end. Her father sat behind his desk, his hands trembling as he read the lines again for the third time. Elowen stood in the doorway of his study, watching the color drain from his face, and felt her stomach twist into a hard, cold knot. Outside, rain lashed against the windows of their crumbling townhouse, and somewhere upstairs her two younger sisters were laughing over a game of cards, unaware that their entire future was being decided in the room below them. "Father," Elowen said quietly, stepping forward, "what has happened?" Baronet Ashcombe looked up at her, and for the first time in her 22 years, she saw real fear in his eyes. "We are ruined," he said. "The creditors have called in every debt. By the end of the month we will lose this house, and your sisters will have nothing. No dowry, no future, nothing." Elowen's mind raced through every possibility, but before she could speak, there was a knock at the front door. A hard, deliberate knock, the kind that demanded to be answered. Her father flinched as though the sound itself might break him. "That will be him," he whispered. "Him who?" Her father did not answer. He simply rose from his chair, straightened his coat with shaking hands, and walked toward the door as a man walks toward his own execution. Elowen followed, her heart pounding, though she did not yet understand why. The man who stood on their threshold was tall, dressed in black, with sharp eyes the color of storm clouds and a face that seemed carved from stone. He did not remove his hat as he stepped inside, nor did he offer any greeting beyond a curt nod. "Baronet Ashcombe," he said, his voice low and clipped. "I trust you received my letter." "I did, Your Grace," her father said, his voice barely steady. "Please, come in." Elowen's breath caught. "Your Grace." This was no ordinary creditor. This was a duke. They moved into the drawing room, and it was only once they were seated that the stranger's gaze finally settled on Elowen, sweeping over her with an assessing coldness that made her want to look away, though pride kept her chin lifted. "This is my daughter," her father said, "Elowen." The duke studied her for a long moment. "I am Julian Ashford, Duke of Harrogate," he said. "I understand your father owes a significant sum to several men who answer to me. I have come to discuss how that debt might be resolved." Elowen glanced at her father, whose face had gone the color of ash. "Resolved how?" she asked, before her father could speak. The duke's eyes flicked toward her, and something in them sharpened, as though he had not expected her to speak at all, let alone so directly. "I require a wife," he said simply, "for 1 year, in name only. In exchange, I will settle every debt your father owes, in full, and provide a sum sufficient to secure your sister's futures." The room went utterly silent. Elowen heard the rain against the glass, the distant creak of the house settling, the frantic beat of her own heart. "You are asking me to marry you," she said slowly, "as a transaction." "I am asking you to save your family," the Duke corrected, his tone flat, without apology. "Whether you call it a transaction or a rescue is a matter of perspective." Her father made a small, desperate sound. "Elowen, please, consider what he is offering." She looked between the two men, feeling as though the floor had tilted beneath her. She was not a fool. She understood exactly what this man was offering, and exactly what it would cost her. A year of her life, bound to a stranger with cold eyes and colder words, in exchange for her sister's futures. "Why me?" she asked the Duke. "You could have any woman in London." "I do not want any woman in London," he said. "I want a wife who will not ask questions, will not seek my affection, and will not interfere in my affairs. Your family's situation makes you unlikely to refuse, and unlikely to expect more from the arrangement than what is stated. It is practical, nothing more." The words should have wounded her, and in some small way they did, but beneath the sting was something else, something that steadied her spine instead of breaking it. If this man wanted a wife who asked for nothing, she would give him exactly that, and not one thing more. "And after the year?" she asked. "The marriage will be quietly dissolved. You will receive a settlement of your own, sufficient to live independently, should you choose. Your family's debts will remain paid. No one need ever know the truth of the arrangement." Elowen's mind turned over the offer from every angle, searching for the trap, the trick, the hidden cost. She found none that she could see, only the plain, brutal practicality of a man who wanted a problem solved and had chosen the cheapest possible solution. "I need to speak with my father," she said. The Duke inclined his head. "You have 1 day. I will not wait longer than that. There are other arrangements I can pursue if this does not suit you." He rose, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met hers again, and Elowen thought she saw something flicker behind the coldness, something almost like curiosity, though it vanished before she could name it. When the door closed behind him, her father collapsed into a chair, his hands over his face. "I am sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted this for you." Elowen knelt beside him and took his hands in hers. "Do not apologize," she said. "We will survive this. We always have." Later that evening, her younger sister Margaret slipped into the drawing room and settled beside her on the worn settee, curiosity bright in her eyes. Who was that man? Elowen? The one who frightened father so badly? Elowen forced a small smile, careful to keep her voice light. "A gentleman who wishes to help us with our troubles. Nothing for you to worry over." "He did not look like the sort of man who helps anyone," Margaret said, wise beyond her 14 years. "He looked like a man who takes." Elowen said nothing to that, because she feared her sister might be right, and because there was no way to explain the truth without frightening her further. Instead, she squeezed Margaret's hand and sent her off to bed, promising that everything would be well. Alone again, Elowen allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what she had agreed to. A year of her life given away to a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem. She thought of the girls she had grown up with, the ones who had married for love, or at the very least for genuine affection, and felt a pang of something sharp and unwelcome. Envy, perhaps, or simple grief, for a future she had never truly believed she would have anyway. She had never been the daughter men noticed at balls. She had always been the sensible one, the practical one, the sister who managed the household accounts while others danced. Perhaps that was precisely why the Duke's offer did not feel entirely like a tragedy. She had already resigned herself, long before this letter arrived, to a life built on duty rather than romance. This was simply duty arriving sooner, and in a stranger form than she had ever expected. That night, she sat by the window in the room she shared with her youngest sister, watching the rain finally clear to reveal a sky scattered with cold, distant stars. She thought of her sisters, still innocent of the danger they had narrowly escaped, and she thought of the Duke's stony face, his flat, unfeeling voice, the way he had spoken of her as though she were a ledger entry to be balanced. She was afraid. She would not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. But fear had never once stopped her from doing what needed to be done, and it would not stop her now. By morning, her decision was made. She found her father at breakfast, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. "I will do it," she said, before he could ask. "I will marry the Duke." Relief and grief crossed his face in the same breath. "Elowen, are you certain? A year bound to a man like that?" "A year is not forever," she said, though even as she spoke the words, something in her chest tightened at the thought of what a year might hold, trapped in a stranger's cold house, bound by vows that meant nothing to either of them. "And my sister's futures are worth far more than my comfort." The message was sent that afternoon, and the Duke's reply came within hours, brief and businesslike. The wedding would take place in a fortnight, at his estate, with only the necessary witnesses present, no fanfare, no celebration. A transaction, sealed by law. The following 2 weeks passed in a blur of practical arrangements, lawyers' visits, and quiet, unspoken grief. Elowen said little to her sisters about the true nature of the marriage, allowing them to believe it was simply a fortunate match, a stroke of luck that had saved them all. She could not bring herself to tell them the truth, that their salvation had been purchased with her own uncertain future. On the morning of the wedding, she stood before the mirror in a gown that was elegant but plain, chosen not for beauty but for propriety, and studied the young woman staring back at her. She looked calm. She looked composed. Only she knew how hard she was working to keep it that way. The ceremony itself was brief, cold, and utterly without warmth. The chapel was nearly empty, its walls echoing with the vicar's formal words. Julian stood beside her, tall and unreadable, his jaw set, his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder throughout the entire ceremony, as though he could not quite bring himself to look at her directly. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace, only a stiff nod from the Duke and a brief, businesslike handshake, as though they had concluded nothing more than a contract negotiation. As they left the chapel, Elowen glanced up at the man who was now, by every legal measure, her husband. His face gave away nothing. Whatever thoughts moved behind those storm-gray eyes remained entirely his own. "We leave for Harrogate Hall within the hour," he said, his tone as flat and distant as it had been the day they met. "You will find the household staff have been informed. There should be no confusion regarding your position there." "And what is my position?" Elowen asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. For the first time, something almost like surprise crossed his face at her tone. "My wife," he said simply. "Nothing more is required of you." Elowen held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. "Then I shall be exactly that," she said. "Nothing more and nothing less." Something shifted in his expression. So briefly she almost missed it. A flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply surprise that she had not wept, had not begged, had not crumbled beneath the weight of what he had asked of her. The carriage that carried them away from London was silent for the entire journey, the space between them heavy with everything neither of them was willing to say. Elowen watched the city give way to countryside through the window, her new husband's cold profile reflected faintly in the glass beside her own. Whatever waited for her at Harrogate Hall, she resolved to face it exactly as she had faced everything else in her life, with her spine straight, her chin lifted, and her heart carefully, deliberately guarded. She did not yet know that the coldest man in England was about to become the greatest complication of her entire life. Harrogate Hall rose out of the mist like something from an old, half-forgotten story, gray stone walls stretching toward a sky heavy with clouds, its windows dark and unwelcoming despite the early hour. Elowen stepped down from the carriage and felt the chill of the place settle over her before she had even crossed the threshold. The staff stood arranged in 2 neat rows to greet her, their faces carefully blank, though Elowen did not miss the curious glances a few of the younger maids exchanged. At the front of the line stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight knot and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Whitfield," Julian said, his tone as businesslike as ever. "My wife will require the East Wing prepared. She is to have whatever she needs." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, dropping into a brief curtsy before turning her attention to Elowen. "Welcome to Harrogate Hall, my lady." Julian did not linger. Within moments of the introductions, he excused himself to his study, leaving Elowen standing in the vast entrance hall with nothing but a housekeeper and a household full of strangers for company. She told herself she had expected this. She had not expected how quickly the loneliness would settle into her bones. Mrs. Whitfield led her through the house, pointing out rooms with brisk efficiency, though her sharp eyes lingered on Elowen more than once, as though trying to determine what sort of woman the Duke had brought home this time. "Has the Duke been married before?" Elowen asked, unable to help herself. Something flickered across the housekeeper's face, there and gone. "No, my lady. You are his first wife. But there is something you are not telling me." Mrs. Whitfield paused at the top of the staircase, her hand resting on the banister. "It is not my place to speak of the Duke's affairs," she said carefully. "But I will say this. He was not always as he is now. There was a time this house was full of laughter. What changed?" The housekeeper's expression closed like a door. "That is a story for another day, my lady, and not one I am free to tell." She continued up the stairs before Elowen could press further, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the cold hallway air. The East Wing, when Elowen finally reached it, was spacious but sparse, decorated in muted colors that seemed designed to draw no attention whatsoever. It was, she thought, very much like the man who owned it, beautiful in its bones, but stripped of anything resembling warmth. A letter from Margaret arrived on Elowen's 3rd morning at Harrogate Hall, full of questions about the grand house and gentle teasing about her new title. Elowen sat at the small writing desk in her room and composed a careful reply, describing the gardens and the fine horses, saying nothing of the silence that filled every room, or the husband who had barely spoken 10 words to her since the wedding. She could not bring herself to worry her sisters with the truth. Better they believe her happy, or at least comfortable, than know how alone she truly felt within these vast stone walls. She sealed the letter and handed it to a passing footman, then stood at her window for a long while, watching mist curl low over the distant hills. Somewhere in this house, her husband sat behind a closed door, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly had made him the way he was. A man did not build walls so high, so carefully, without something terrible on the other side of them. Over the following days, Elowen settled into a routine that felt more like exile than marriage. She took her meals largely alone, as Julian kept to his study for hours at a time, emerging only for brief, silent dinners during which he spoke perhaps a dozen words total. The servants treated her with careful politeness, but none dared engage her beyond what duty required, as though they had been trained to keep their distance from anything connected to their master's private life. It was Mrs. Whitfield who first broke through the careful walls of the household, though even she did so slowly, cautiously, testing the ground before committing to anything resembling friendship. Elowen made a point of seeking her out, asking about the running of the house, offering suggestions where she saw fit, and slowly, The housekeeper's guarded politeness began to soften into something warmer. "You are not what I expected, my lady," Mrs. Whitfield admitted one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens, which had clearly once been beautiful, but now sat overgrown and neglected. "The Duke does not often bring warmth into this house." "Perhaps this house could use a bit more warmth," Elowen said, surveying the tangled rose bushes and weed-choked paths. "Would anyone object if I had the gardens restored?" Mrs. Whitfield's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile Elowen had yet seen from her. "I doubt anyone would object, my lady, though I cannot promise the Duke will notice." Elowen began her quiet campaign the very next day, instructing the few remaining gardeners on which beds to clear first, which paths to reopen, which ancient roses might still be coaxed back to life with patience and care. It was, she told herself, simply a way to occupy her time in a house that offered her little else to do. If some small, stubborn part of her hoped the Duke might notice, might see the change and understand what she was trying to build, she did not examine that hope too closely. She also began, slowly, to reshape the rhythms of the house itself. She requested that fresh flowers be brought in for the dining room, over the housekeeper's initial hesitation. She asked that the heavy curtains in the main hall be opened during the day, letting actual daylight into rooms that had clearly not seen it in years. Small changes, each one a quiet act of defiance against the cold stillness that had ruled this house long before her arrival. Julian said nothing about any of it for nearly 2 weeks, and Elowen began to wonder if he even noticed his own home changing around him. Then, one evening at dinner, he set down his fork and looked at her directly for the first time in days. "The flowers," he said, "and the curtains, this was your doing." Elowen met his gaze steadily, refusing to apologize for something that had not been forbidden. "You said I could have whatever I needed. I needed a house that did not feel like a tomb." Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite name, gone before she could study it. "It is not to my displeasure," he said finally, his tone stiff, as though the admission cost him something. "Continue if you wish." It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was something, a small crack in the wall he had built so carefully around himself, and Elowen found herself unreasonably pleased by it. Encouraged, she began joining him for a few minutes after dinner each evening, sitting near the fire in the drawing room while he read through papers from his study, saying little, but no longer retreating entirely to opposite corners of the house the moment the meal ended. He did not seem to mind her presence, though he rarely acknowledged it beyond the occasional glance over the top of his papers, as though checking that she was still there, still real, still an unexpected fixture in a life he had arranged to be as empty as possible. One evening, curiosity got the better of her, and she asked about a portrait that hung above the drawing-room mantel, a young man with dark hair and an easy, open smile so unlike anything she had seen on Julian's face. "Who is that?" she asked, nodding toward the painting. Julian's entire posture changed, his shoulders going rigid, his jaw tightening in a way she had come to recognize as the sign of a door slamming shut somewhere behind his eyes. "My brother," he said, after a long pause. "Edmund. He has your eyes," Elowen said carefully, sensing she had wandered into dangerous territory, but unwilling to retreat entirely. "He had many things that were mine," Julian said, his voice low and strange, before he rose abruptly and excused himself, leaving Elowen alone by the fire with 100 unanswered questions, and the distinct sense that she had touched something raw and unhealed. She did not raise the subject again, though she found herself studying the portrait whenever she passed through the drawing room, wondering what had happened to the smiling young man in the painting, and what part his absence played in the cold, guarded silence that had swallowed his brother whole. Mrs. Whitfield, when gently pressed again a few days later, offered only fragments. "Master Edmund was the younger brother," she said quietly, checking that no other servants were within earshot. "Full of light, that one was. The whole house changed when he died. And the Duke changed most of all." "How did he die?" The housekeeper's face grew shuttered once more. "That, my lady, is not mine to tell. Ask his grace, if you have the courage. But I would choose your moment carefully." Elowen turned the housekeeper's words over for days afterward, piecing together fragments of a tragedy she did not yet understand, watching her husband more closely for signs of the grief he kept so carefully hidden beneath layers of cold formality. She began to see it in small things, the way his gaze sometimes lingered too long on the empty chair at the far end of the dining table, the way certain rooms in the house remained permanently closed, their doors never opened in all the weeks she had lived there. Whatever had happened to Edmund, it had clearly broken something in Julian that had never been allowed to heal. The true turning point came nearly 3 weeks into her stay. On a gray, blustery afternoon, when Elowen decided to explore the stables, curious about the horses she had glimpsed from her window. She had always loved horses, had spent countless hours as a girl in her father's modest stable before their fortunes had declined so sharply, and the sight of Harrowgate's fine animals drew her outside despite the threatening weather. She was admiring a tall gray mare when the animal, startled by a sudden crack of thunder, reared back sharply, catching Elowen off guard. She stumbled, her foot catching on a loose board, and fell hard against the stall door, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The mare's hooves came dangerously close as the animal thrashed in fright, and for one terrifying moment, Elowen could not find her footing to scramble away. Then strong arms were around her, pulling her back and away from danger, and she found herself pressed against Julian's chest, his heart pounding beneath her ear as fast as her own. He had appeared from nowhere, moving faster than she had thought possible for a man usually so contained, so deliberate in every motion. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, stripped of its usual cold composure, edged with something that sounded almost like fear. "I am well," Elowen managed, though her voice shook slightly, only startled. He did not release her immediately. For a long moment they simply stood there, his arms still around her, his breath uneven against her hair, and Elowen became acutely aware of how close he was, of the warmth of him after weeks of careful, cold distance. When he finally stepped back, his composure had returned, but something in his eyes had not entirely settled back into place. "You should not come to the stables alone," he said, his tone rougher than usual. "It is not safe." "I have ridden since I was a child," Elowen said, straightening her skirts, trying to steady her own racing heart. "I am not so easily frightened." "That is not what concerns me." The words left him before he seemed to intend them, and something flickered across his face, surprise at his own admission, perhaps, or something deeper he had not meant to reveal. Elowen held his gaze, her pulse still unsteady from more than the fall. "Then what does concern you, Your Grace?" He did not answer. Instead, he offered her his arm, formal and correct once more, and walked her back toward the house in silence, though she noticed his jaw remained tight the entire way, as though he were fighting some internal battle she could not see. That night, alone in her room, Elowen found herself replaying the moment again and again, the feel of his arms around her, the roughness in his voice, the flicker of something raw in his eyes before he had shuttered it away. She told herself it meant nothing, that any man would have reacted the same way to seeing his wife nearly trampled, regardless of his feelings toward her. But she could not quite make herself believe it. Something had shifted between them in the stable, some careful boundary quietly crossed, and though neither of them spoke of it again in the days that followed, Elowen sensed that the cold, distant marriage she had agreed to was already becoming something far more complicated than either of them had bargained for. She noticed small changes in him after that day, subtle things a stranger might never have caught. He lingered a moment longer at dinner before retreating to his study. He asked, once, whether she had slept well, the question awkward and stilted, as though he were unused to the shape of such ordinary kindness in his own mouth. He began taking his morning coffee in the breakfast room instead of alone in his study, and though he said little across the table, his presence there each morning felt, to Elowen, like a door left deliberately ajar. She did not know what to make of it, this careful, halting thaw in a man who had built his entire life around remaining unreachable. But she found herself watching for it all the same, waiting each day to see what small crack might appear next in the walls surrounding Julian Ashford, Duke of Harrowgate, and wondering, with a curiosity she did not entirely trust, what she might find if those walls ever came down completely. The carriage arrived unannounced on a wet Tuesday afternoon, its wheels churning up the gravel drive with a violence that suggested its owner cared little for the state of the grounds he was destroying. Elowen watched from the window as a well-dressed man stepped down, his smile too wide, too practiced, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes above it. "Lord Instow," Mrs. Whitfield said grimly, appearing at Elowen's shoulder with an expression that could curdle milk. "The Duke's cousin. I had hoped we would be spared his visits a little longer." "He is not welcome here?" "He is family, my lady, so he is welcome by law. Whether he is welcome by any other measure is a different matter entirely." Julian met his cousin in the entrance hall with a coldness that made his usual reserve toward Elowen seem almost warm by comparison. "Instow," he said, not bothering to disguise his displeasure. "You did not send word." "Would you have received me if I had?" Instow's laugh was light, careless, utterly at odds with the calculating gleam in his eyes, as they swept over Elowen with open, assessing curiosity. "And this must be the new Duchess. How extraordinary. I confess I did not believe the rumors when they reached me." "What rumors?" Elowen asked, keeping her voice level despite the unease crawling up her spine. Only that my dear cousin had finally taken a wife, after swearing for years he never would. Insto's smile sharpened. You must forgive my surprise, Your Grace. Julian has always been rather particular about who he allows close to him. Some things are worth reconsidering, Julian said flatly, offering nothing further, though Elowen noticed the tension coiled tight in his shoulders, the careful stillness of a man bracing for a blow he knew was coming. Insto stayed for dinner, uninvited but unwilling to be turned away, and through 3 long, uncomfortable courses, he needled his cousin with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of cruelty, disguised as conversation. Tell me, Insto said, swirling wine in his glass as he studied Elowen across the table. How did the two of you meet? Julian has never been one for society events. I cannot imagine where he found you. That is our business, Insto, Julian said, his voice a warning Elowen had not heard him use before. Of course, of course. Insto held up his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes remained sharp, calculating. I only ask because the timing is curious, is it not? A sudden marriage, so soon after the terms of your father's will became public, almost as though it were arranged out of necessity, rather than affection. The barb landed precisely where it was meant to, and Elowen felt her spine stiffen, refusing to let the accusation sit unanswered. I fail to see why the timing of a marriage should concern anyone but the 2 people entering into it, she said coolly, meeting Insto's gaze without flinching. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, at finding resistance where he had expected only silence. A woman with opinions, he said, recovering his smile. How refreshing. I confess I did not expect Julian to choose someone quite so spirited. You will find, Elowen said, that his choices are rarely what people expect. Across the table, she caught Julian watching her, something unreadable in his expression, though she thought, for just a moment, that the corner of his mouth might have twitched toward something like approval. Later in the meal, Insto turned his attention to Elowen's family, his questions couched in polite curiosity but clearly designed to unearth something he could use. Your father is Baronet Ashcombe, I understand, he said, cutting into his meat with deliberate precision. A respectable name, though I confess I had not heard it mentioned in society circles for some years. Financial difficulties, was it not? Rather severe ones, if the rumors I have heard are accurate. Elowen felt the heat of embarrassment rise briefly in her cheeks, but she refused to let it show in her voice. My family's private affairs are hardly a fitting topic for dinner conversation, Lord Insto. Forgive me, Insto said, though his smile suggested no genuine remorse at all. I only mean to say that it must have been a great relief to your father, this marriage. Quite the fortunate turn of events, wouldn't you agree, cousin? He turned his gaze pointedly toward Julian. A duke in need of a hasty wife, and a baronet in need of a hasty solution to his debts. How very convenient that the 2 problems solved each other so neatly. Fortune favors those who are prepared to act when opportunity presents itself, Julian said, his voice cold enough that even Insto's easy confidence seemed to falter slightly. I would think a man in your position, cousin, might understand something of seizing convenient opportunities. The barb struck home, and for a brief, satisfying moment, Insto's practiced smile slipped, revealing something sharper and less pleasant underneath. He recovered quickly, but the exchange left a clear mark on the remainder of the evening, both men circling each other with the wary caution of predators unwilling to show weakness. Insto did not relent easily. Throughout the remainder of the meal, he circled the topic of the will and the inheritance again and again, each time dressed in different, more subtle language, testing for cracks in the marriage's legitimacy, searching for any weakness he might later exploit. Elowen matched him at every turn, her responses calm and measured, giving him nothing to seize upon, and by the end of the evening, she saw something new in Julian's gaze when it settled on her, not merely tolerance, something closer to genuine respect. When Insto finally departed, promising with false warmth to visit again soon, the house seemed to exhale around them, the tension of his presence lifting like a held breath finally released. He will contest the will regardless of what we do, Julian said quietly, once the sound of Insto's carriage had faded into the distance. Nothing we do will satisfy him. He wants Harrogate for himself, and he will not stop until he has exhausted every possible avenue. Then we will simply have to give him nothing to work with, Elowen said. Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. You handled him well tonight, he said, the words clearly costing him some effort, as though praise were a language he had long since forgotten how to speak. Most people find themselves entirely unmoored by Insto's particular brand of cruelty. I have had a great deal of practice remaining steady under difficult circumstances, Elowen said simply. He nodded, and for a moment, Something almost like a smile touched his features before it disappeared again beneath his usual composure. "Will you sit with me a while?" he asked, gesturing toward the library. "I find I am not yet ready to retreat to my study." It was such an unexpected invitation that Eowyn nearly hesitated, but curiosity won out over caution, and she followed him into the library, where a fire already burned low in the grate, casting long shadows across shelves heavy with leather-bound books. Julian poured himself a glass of brandy, then, after a moment's consideration, poured a second for her, setting it on the small table between two chairs positioned near the fire. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the flames the only sound in the room, until Julian spoke again, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You asked about the portrait," he said, "in the drawing room." Eowyn's breath caught. She had not expected him to raise the subject himself, not after the way he had shut down so completely the first time. "You do not have to speak of it," she said carefully, "if you do not wish to." "I know." He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes, and for a long moment, she thought he might retreat into silence entirely. Then he spoke again, his voice low and rough. "Edmund was 3 years younger than me. He was everything I was not, warm, easy with people, the kind of man everyone loved the moment they met him. What happened to him?" Julian's jaw tightened, but he did not stop. "There was an accident. A boating accident. On the lake at the edge of the estate, 4 years ago this coming autumn. We had gone out together, the two of us, as we had 100 times before. A storm rose faster than either of us anticipated, and the boat capsized." He paused, his hand tightening around his glass. "I made it to shore. Edmund did not." Eowyn felt the weight of the confession settle over the room like a physical thing. "Julian," she said softly, "that was not your fault." "Wasn't it?" His voice cracked, just slightly, the first genuine fracture she had seen in his composure since the day they met. "I was the elder brother. I was the stronger swimmer. I should have been able to save him, and instead I watched him disappear beneath the water, and there was nothing I could do. You said yourself the storm rose without warning. You cannot hold yourself responsible for the sea, Julian." "Everyone else seems to manage it well enough," he said bitterly. "My father certainly did. He looked at me differently after that day, as though I had failed some fundamental test of what it meant to be his heir. Edmund had been the son he adored without effort. I was simply the one who remained." The pain in his voice was so raw, so unguarded, that Eowyn felt something in her own chest ache in response. She reached across the small space between their chairs and rested her hand over his, an instinctive gesture of comfort she did not stop to consider before offering it. "Your father was wrong," she said firmly. "Grief does not require blame to make sense of itself, but people often search for someone to hold responsible regardless. That does not mean the responsibility is real." Julian looked down at her hand covering his, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his eyes. Some wall lowered, if only slightly, if only for this one unguarded moment beside the fire. "I have not spoken of this to anyone," he admitted. "Not truly, not since it happened." "Why tell me now?" He considered the question seriously, as though searching for an honest answer rather than a convenient one. "I am not entirely certain," he said finally. "Perhaps because you did not flinch from Insto tonight, when most would have crumbled. Perhaps because you asked about the portrait with genuine curiosity, rather than idle gossip. Or perhaps simply because, for reasons I cannot fully explain, I find myself wanting you to understand." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected, and Eowyn found herself unable to look away from him, from the vulnerability so carefully hidden beneath every cold word he had spoken to her since their first meeting. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me with it." Something shifted in his expression, and for the briefest moment she thought he might lean toward her, might close the small distance between their chairs entirely. Then he seemed to catch himself, drawing back slightly, the familiar composure sliding back over his features like a curtain falling closed. "It grows late," he said, his voice returning to its usual careful control, though something in his eyes remained softer than before. "You should rest." Eowyn rose, understanding that whatever had opened between them tonight had reached its limit for now, though she sensed it would not be so easily closed again as it had been before. "Good night, Julian," she said, using his given name for the first time since her arrival at Harrogate Hall. He looked up at her, something flickering across his face at the sound of his own name in her voice. "Good night, Eowyn." As she climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself replaying every word of the evening, the confession beside the fire, the rawness in his voice, the way his hand had felt beneath hers, warm despite everything cold he presented to the world. She had come to Harrogate Hall believing she understood exactly what she had agreed to, a year of cold formality in exchange for her family's security. She was beginning to suspect that understanding had been badly, dangerously incomplete. The man behind the Duke's careful armor was not cold at all. He was simply a man who had learned, through grief too heavy to carry alone, that armor was safer than vulnerability, distance safer than the risk of losing something else he might come to love. And Elowen, despite every warning instinct telling her to guard her own heart just as carefully, found herself wondering what it might take to convince him that some risks were worth taking after all. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake long after the candles had burned low, listening to the wind move through the old stone corridors of Harrogate Hall, and thought of storm-gray eyes finally, briefly, unguarded, and of a hand beneath hers that had not pulled away. The following morning she came down to breakfast half expecting Julian to have retreated once more behind his usual walls, embarrassed perhaps by how much he had revealed the night before. Instead, she found him already seated at the table, and though he said little as she took her seat, he lifted his gaze to meet hers with something steadier in his expression than she had seen before, an acknowledgement, quiet and unspoken, that something between them had genuinely shifted. "I have been thinking," he said, once the servants had withdrawn from the room, "that Insto will not simply disappear because we gave him nothing to seize upon last night. He will return, and he will bring sharper tools next time." "What sort of tools?" "Lawyers. Documents. Whatever he believes might cast doubt on the legitimacy of our marriage, or on my fitness to inherit." Julian set down his cup, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded, a welcome change from his usual careful distance. "I would rather we were prepared for whatever he attempts than caught unaware." "Then we prepare," Elowen said simply. "Tell me what I need to know, and I will not be caught unaware either." Something in his expression softened at her easy willingness to stand beside him against whatever threat his cousin might bring. "Most people in your position," he said quietly, "would have already fled back to London, content to collect their settlement and leave the family troubles to the family." "I am not most people," Elowen said, "and this stopped being only your trouble the moment I signed my name beside yours." He studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing behind his eyes before he looked away, back toward the window and the gray morning light beyond it. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "I am beginning to understand that you are not most people at all." They spent the remainder of the morning together in his study, Julian walking her through the details of his father's will, the specific conditions Insto might attempt to exploit, the legal safeguards already in place to protect the marriage from challenge. It was the longest stretch of time they had spent together since the wedding, and Elowen found herself surprised by how easily the hours passed, how naturally their conversation moved from legal strategy to smaller, more personal exchanges, fragments of history and preference offered cautiously between them, like two people slowly, carefully learning the shape of each other. By the time she finally retired to her own room that evening, Elowen understood two things with equal certainty. First, that Lord Insto would not rest until he had exhausted every possible means of tearing their marriage apart. And second, that whatever this marriage had become in these past weeks, it was no longer the cold, empty arrangement either of them had originally agreed to. Something real had begun to grow in the space between them, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably alive. Elowen sat by her window long after the house had gone quiet, watching moonlight silver the neglected gardens she had spent weeks slowly restoring, and allowed herself, for the first time since the wedding, to wonder what might happen when the year finally came to its end. She had entered this marriage believing she understood its boundaries completely, a temporary arrangement, cold and practical, easily forgotten once the 12 months had passed. Now she was no longer certain such easy forgetting would be possible at all. Julian Ashford had shown her, in the space of a single evening, that the ice surrounding him was not his true nature, but a shelter, built from grief he had never been permitted to release. And she found herself wanting, quite fiercely, to be the one who helped him finally set that burden down. Whether he wanted the same thing in return remained an open question, one she was not yet brave enough to ask aloud. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, she carried with her the memory of his hand beneath hers, steady and warm, and allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous hope that perhaps, before this year was through, they might both discover something neither of them had dared to expect when this arrangement first began. The invitation arrived in Boston gold, and Julian's expression darkened the moment he read it. "Lady Pemberton's ball," he said, setting the card down on the breakfast table with more force than necessary. "We cannot avoid this one, Half of London will be in attendance, and our absence would only feed the very rumors Insto is so eager to spread. Elowen studied the invitation, feeling a knot of nerves tighten in her stomach. She had attended few society events in her life, and none as the wife of a duke, with every eye in the room certain to be watching her every move, searching for cracks in a marriage that had, until recently, felt like exactly the kind of hollow arrangement society whispered about. "We will need to appear convincing," Julian said, watching her carefully. "As a genuine match. Can you manage that?" "Can you?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, and something almost like humor flickered across his face, rare and unexpected. "I suppose we shall find out together." In the days leading up to the ball, Elowen found herself spending long hours with a dressmaker Julian had summoned from London, a brisk, efficient woman who measured and pinned and fussed over fabric samples until Elowen's head spun with color and silk. Julian had insisted, quietly but firmly, that she have whatever gown she wished, sparing no expense, and though Elowen had initially protested such extravagance, she found herself secretly pleased by the gesture, small as it was. "He does not usually concern himself with such things," Mrs. Whitfield remarked one afternoon, watching the dressmaker's assistants carry bolts of deep blue silk up the staircase. The last duchess, had there ever been one, would have waited a very long time for such attention. "Perhaps he simply wishes to avoid further embarrassment at the ball," Elowen said, though even as she spoke the words, she did not quite believe them. Mrs. Whitfield's knowing smile suggested she did not believe them either. "Perhaps, my lady. Or perhaps the Duke has finally found something worth the effort." On the evening of the ball itself, Elowen stood before her mirror as her maid fastened the final pins in her hair, studying her reflection with a strange sense of unfamiliarity. The gown, a deep sapphire blue that caught the candlelight beautifully, transformed her into someone she barely recognized, elegant and confident in a way she had never quite felt as the overlooked daughter of a struggling baronet. A knock sounded at her door, and when she opened it, she found Julian standing in the corridor, dressed in formal black, his expression shifting into something unreadable the moment his eyes settled on her. "You look," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words adequate to the moment and finding none sufficient. "You look extraordinary, Elowen." The simple sincerity in his voice warmed her far more than any practiced compliment could have managed. "Thank you," she said softly. "You look rather extraordinary yourself, Your Grace." Something flickered in his eyes at the teasing formality of the title, and for a moment, the tension between them felt almost playful, a lightness neither of them had allowed themselves before. He offered his arm, and she took it, and together they descended toward the waiting carriage, toward an evening that would test everything fragile and new that had begun growing quietly between them. The ball itself was a glittering affair, the Pemberton townhouse ablaze with candlelight, every room filled with silk and jewels and the low murmur of 100 private conversations, most of them, Elowen suspected, concerning the two of them. She felt the weight of curious stares the moment they entered, whispers trailing behind them like a current beneath the music. Julian, to her surprise, kept close at her side all evening, his hand resting at the small of her back with a possessiveness that felt entirely too natural for a marriage built on paper and practicality. When they were finally announced onto the dance floor, his arm around her waist, his hand clasping hers, Elowen found herself acutely, uncomfortably aware of how easily her body responded to his nearness, how her heart quickened with something that had nothing to do with performance. "You are staring," Julian murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, though his eyes held a warmth that undercut the teasing edge of his words. "I am simply playing my part convincingly, Your Grace," she said, matching his tone, though her cheeks warmed regardless. "Convincing," he repeated softly, his gaze dropping briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes, "is precisely the word I would choose as well." The dance stretched on longer than propriety strictly required, neither of them making any move to separate when the music finally slowed toward its natural end, until the next set began and other couples moved to claim the floor around them. When Julian finally released her hand, Elowen felt the absence of his touch far more acutely than she wanted to admit. They might have continued the evening in relative peace had Insto not chosen that precise moment to make his presence known, appearing at Elowen's elbow with a glass of champagne and a smile that promised nothing good. "Duchess," he said smoothly, "you dance beautifully, almost convincingly enough to silence the rumors currently circulating this very ballroom." "What rumors, Lord Insto?" Elowen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Only that your marriage was arranged with rather more haste than affection would typically require. Some are even suggesting the entire arrangement exists solely to satisfy the conditions of my late uncle's will, with little genuine feeling involved on either side. Insto's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. I do hope, for both your sakes, that such rumors are entirely unfounded. Before Elowen could formulate a response, Julian appeared at her side, his expression carved from stone, his eyes fixed on his cousin with an intensity that made several nearby guests fall conspicuously silent. You will not speak of my wife in such terms again, Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable warning that silenced the surrounding conversation entirely. Whatever doubts you harbor about my marriage, Insto, you would do well to keep them to yourself, both for your own sake and for the sake of whatever remains of this family's dignity. Insto's smile faltered, clearly unprepared for such a direct public confrontation. I meant no offense, cousin, merely. You meant precisely the offense you delivered, Julian cut in coldly. I am no longer willing to indulge your games at my wife's expense. Consider this your final warning. The exchange left Insto visibly rattled, and he retreated shortly after, though not without a final venomous glance in Elowen's direction. Around them, the ballroom slowly resumed its usual chatter, though Elowen could feel dozens of eyes still lingering on them, reassessing everything they thought they understood about the Duke of Harrogate and his unexpected wife. You did not need to defend me so publicly, Elowen said quietly, once they had found a quieter corner of the room, away from curious ears. I wanted to, Julian said simply, and something in the plain honesty of his tone struck her far more deeply than any grand declaration could have managed. I find I do not care for the way he speaks of you. I have not cared for a great many things Insto has said over the years, but this, somehow, matters more than the rest. Elowen studied his face, searching for the calculation, the performance, the careful strategy she had come to expect from him in public settings, and found none of it. Only genuine feeling, raw and slightly startled, as though he himself had not quite anticipated the strength of his own reaction. Julian, she said softly, uncertain how to name what was building between them, unsure if naming it too soon might frighten it away entirely. I know, he said, before she could find the words. I feel it too. For a long moment, they simply stood together, the noise of the ball fading into distant background, the space between them charged with everything neither of them had yet dared to say aloud. Julian's hand found hers again, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles across her knuckles, and Elowen thought, with a sudden, dizzying clarity, that she might be falling in love with the man she had married for entirely practical reasons. There is something I have wanted to tell you, Julian said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers with unusual intensity, since that night in the library. Her heart pounded. Then tell me. He hesitated, and she watched something war behind his eyes, some old, familiar fear rising to reclaim ground it had briefly surrendered. He began, then stopped, his jaw tightening as the walls she had watched him slowly lower began, almost imperceptibly, to rise again. It is not the right moment, not here. Disappointment flickered through her, sharp and unexpected, though she understood, in some deeper part of herself, exactly what held him back. Whatever this was building between them, it frightened him, perhaps more than Insto's threats, more than any scandal society could invent. A year had a defined end. Whatever he felt for her existed within a timeline neither of them had originally intended to survive intact. Then we will wait for the right moment, she said quietly, though something in her chest ached at the retreat, at the door so briefly opened, now closing again, before she could see what lay beyond it. They left the ball shortly after, the carriage ride home passing in a silence far different from the cold, empty silences of their earliest days together. This silence hummed with unspoken things, with a tension neither of them seemed willing to break, though Elowen caught Julian watching her more than once in the dim carriage light, his expression unreadable but undeniably intent. When they finally arrived back at Harrogate Hall, Julian walked her to her door, as he had never once bothered to do before. He lingered there a moment longer than necessary, his eyes searching her face as though memorizing something he feared he might lose. "Good night, Elowen," he said softly. "Good night, Julian," she replied, and for a moment, she thought he might lean forward, might finally close the distance that had stretched between them all evening, charged and unresolved. Instead, he stepped back, offering a small, almost pained smile, before turning and disappearing down the corridor toward his own rooms, leaving Elowen standing alone at her door, her heart still racing from an evening that had changed something between them irrevocably, even if neither of them had yet found the courage to name exactly what that change might mean. She lay awake long into the night, replaying every moment, every look, every unfinished sentence, and understood with growing certainty that whatever fragile thing was building between them, it would not remain hidden much longer. The year they had agreed to was ticking steadily forward, and soon enough, both of them would have to decide whether what they had found together was worth fighting to keep, or whether it was destined, like so much else in Julian's life, to be lost before it ever had the chance to fully bloom. In the weeks that followed the ball, London society could speak of little else besides the sudden, undeniable warmth between the Duke of Harrogate and his young wife. Invitations poured in at a rate the household had never before seen, hostesses across the city suddenly eager to secure the presence of a couple whose story had captured the collective imagination of the season. Whispers that had once questioned the legitimacy of their marriage now turned instead toward speculation about a genuine, unexpected love match, and Eowyn found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Harrogate Hall, welcomed rather than merely tolerated within society's most exclusive circles. Julian, though he would never have admitted it aloud, seemed to soften further with each passing week, his guarded reserve giving way, slowly but steadily, to something warmer and more present. He sought out her company more often now, no longer retreating to his study the moment dinner concluded, and Eowyn found herself treasuring these quiet evenings together. The comfortable silences that had once felt so cold now filled with an easy, unspoken understanding neither of them fully dared to name. Yet beneath the growing warmth, a quiet tension remained, unspoken but ever present. Neither of them had forgotten the terms of their original agreement, nor the year that continued, relentlessly, to draw closer to its conclusion. Eowyn caught Julian, more than once, watching her with an expression of quiet, troubled longing, as though he were already mourning something he had not yet lost. She understood the feeling all too well, for she carried the same fear within her own chest, the growing certainty that whatever they were building together might be measured out in months rather than a lifetime, bound by a contract neither of them had originally intended to outlast. Late one night, unable to sleep, Eowyn wandered down to the library, drawn by habit toward the room where their fragile understanding had first begun to take shape. She found Julian already there, a single candle burning low beside him, a stack of legal papers spread across the desk that she recognized, with a small jolt, as the original terms of their marriage contract. "Cannot sleep either?" she asked softly from the doorway. He looked up, and something vulnerable crossed his face before he could smooth it away. "I find myself reading this document rather more often than I once did," he admitted, "searching perhaps for some clause I overlooked, some possibility I failed to consider when I drafted these terms so carelessly, so certain I would never come to regret them." Eowyn crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "And have you found one?" "Not yet," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the candlelight, "but I find I have not stopped looking." The letter arrived on a morning that had begun, for the first time in weeks, feeling almost peaceful. Eowyn was in the gardens, now fully restored to their former beauty, cutting fresh roses for the dining room table, when a breathless footman found her, his face pale with alarm. "His Grace requires you in the study at once, my lady. It concerns Lord Instow." Her stomach dropped instantly. She hurried inside, roses forgotten on the garden path, and found Julian standing behind his desk, a single sheet of paper clutched in his hand, his face drained of all color. "What has happened?" she asked, closing the study door behind her. Julian's jaw was tight, his eyes hard with a fury she had rarely seen from him. "Instow has produced a letter," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "supposedly written by my father shortly before his death, suggesting Edmund's drowning was not an accident at all. That I bear direct responsibility, deliberately concealed, for my own brother's death." The accusation hit Eowyn like a physical blow. "That is monstrous," she said, "and utterly false." "Instow intends to bring the letter before the estate's trustees within the week," Julian continued, his hands trembling slightly as he set the paper down. "If they believe it, even in part, I could lose everything, the inheritance, the title, all of it, along with whatever remains of my reputation. He has waited years for exactly this kind of opportunity." "Then we will prove the letter false," Eowyn said firmly, refusing to allow panic to take root. "Where did it supposedly come from? Who can verify its origins?" Julian shook his head, some of his fury giving way to something closer to despair. "I do not know. My father has been dead for 2 years. There is no one left to confirm or deny what he did or did not write in his final months." Eowyn took the letter from the desk and studied it carefully, searching for anything that might reveal its true nature. The handwriting looked convincing at first glance, but something about it nagged at her, some detail she could not quite name. "Julian," she said slowly, "do you have any other letters written by your father? Something we might compare against this one?" He nodded, moving to a locked drawer in his desk and retrieving a small bundle of correspondence, his father's handwriting familiar and worn across the aging pages. Elowen laid the two side by side, examining every stroke, every loop and flourish, with the same careful attention she had once given to managing her own father's accounts during their darkest financial years. "Here," she said after several minutes, pointing to a particular letter formation. "Look at how your father writes his lowercase letter G. In every one of these older letters, it curls back beneath itself, quite distinctively. But in Insto's letter, the same letter is formed entirely differently, straight and unlooped." Julian leaned closer, studying the comparison she had laid out, and something like hope flickered across his exhausted features. "You may be right," he said slowly. "It is subtle, but consistent. My father's hand simply did not form letters this way." "We need an expert," Elowen said. "Someone who can examine both documents professionally and testify to the trustees regarding their authenticity or lack of it." Over the following days, they worked together with an urgency that left little room for anything beyond the singular goal of exposing Insto's deception. Julian secured the services of a respected document examiner from London, a meticulous, soft-spoken man who spent hours poring over both the forged letter and dozens of authenticated samples of the late Duke's handwriting. Elowen sat with Julian through every anxious hour of waiting, offering steady reassurance whenever his composure threatened to crack under the weight of what stood to be lost. "You do not have to stay for all of this," Julian said one evening, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. "This is not truly your burden to carry." "It became my burden the moment I became your wife," Elowen said simply, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in this very room, though the meaning behind them had grown far deeper since that first exchange. "I am not going anywhere, Julian. Not now." Something in his expression softened, gratitude, and something warmer mingling together as he studied her across the desk. "I do not know what I would do without you managing to remain so composed through all of this," he admitted. "You have a gift for steadying whatever storm surrounds you." "I have simply had a great deal of practice," she said, echoing an old refrain, though this time she allowed a small smile to accompany the words. The document examiner's report, when it finally arrived, confirmed everything Elowen had suspected. The letter was, without question, a forgery. The handwriting a skilled but ultimately flawed imitation, betrayed by inconsistencies too subtle for an untrained eye but unmistakable under professional examination. More damning still, further investigation revealed the paper itself bore a watermark not manufactured until well after the late Duke's death, an error that made the forgery's origins impossible to dispute. Armed with this evidence, Julian requested an immediate meeting with the estate's trustees, Insto included, determined to expose the deception before it could do any further damage to his reputation or his claim to the title. The meeting itself was tense from its opening moments, Insto's confidence visibly wavering the instant the document examiner began presenting his findings in careful, methodical detail. By the time the report concluded, laying bare every flaw in the forged letter, Insto's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado entirely stripped away. "This is absurd," Insto protested, though his voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. "The letter came to me through a reliable source. I had no reason to doubt its authenticity." "And who, precisely, was this reliable source?" one of the trustees asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. Insto hesitated, clearly searching for an answer that would not further incriminate him, and in that hesitation, Elowen saw the truth confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. Insto had commissioned the forgery himself, desperate enough to secure the inheritance that he had been willing to fabricate evidence of his own cousin's guilt in his brother's death. "I believe," Julian said quietly into the silence that followed, his voice carrying a controlled fury more devastating than any outburst could have managed, "that my cousin owes this room a great deal more honesty than he has thus far provided." Under continued pressure from the trustees, Insto's composure finally crumbled entirely. He admitted, haltingly, that he had commissioned the forged letter from a disgraced clerk with a talent for imitating handwriting, desperate after years of mounting personal debts to secure any claim he could against Harrowgate's considerable fortune. The confession, once begun, could not be stopped, and by the meeting's conclusion, Insto's reputation lay in ruins, his claim to any part of the inheritance permanently and irrevocably forfeited. "You will not contest my position again," Julian said to his cousin, as the meeting drew to its close, his voice quiet but final. "Nor will you set foot on Harrogate land, now or ever again." Insto left without another word, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by the hollow defeat of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Elowen watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted relief that the threat hanging over Julian for so many years had finally, definitively, been lifted. News of Insto's disgrace spread through the household within hours, and for the first time since Elowen's arrival, she saw genuine celebration ripple through the staff of Harrogate Hall. Mrs. Whitfield, usually so composed and measured, actually embraced her briefly in the corridor, her eyes bright with relieved tears. "You have done more for this family in a few short months than anyone has managed in years," the housekeeper said, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not think you understand what you have given this house, my lady. Not merely safety from Insto's schemes, something far greater than that." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. "The Duke has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you, not since long before his brother's death. I confess I had begun to believe he had lost that part of himself entirely, buried it alongside Master Edmund. You have brought it back, whether you realize it or not." The words lodged themselves deep in Elowen's chest, both a comfort and a fresh source of anxious hope. She wrote to her family that same evening, sharing the news of Insto's defeat in careful, measured terms, though she found herself, even as she wrote, unable to fully articulate the tangle of emotions building within her own heart. Margaret's reply arrived within days, full of excitement and gentle teasing questions about whether the Duke had finally shown any sign of genuine affection. Questions Elowen found she could not answer honestly, not even to herself. The following days passed in a strange, suspended calm, the household settling back into its rhythms now that the shadow of Insto's threat had finally lifted. Julian seemed lighter, somehow, freed from a burden Elowen suspected he had carried for years longer than the recent crisis alone accounted for. He sought her out more often now, small gestures accumulating between them. A hand offered at the bottom of the stairs, a shared joke over breakfast, moments of unguarded warmth that made the growing ache in Elowen's chest all the more difficult to ignore. That evening, alone together in the library once more, the fire burning warm against the encroaching autumn chill, Julian turned to her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before, something raw and unguarded, and entirely without the careful composure he usually maintained. "I could not have done this without you," he said quietly. "Not the discovery of the forgery, not the courage to face him directly, none of it." "You underestimate yourself," Elowen said. "You would have found a way." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I do not believe I would have found the strength to face it without collapsing entirely. Not without you steady beside me through every hour of it." He paused, something building behind his eyes that made her breath catch in anticipation. "Elowen, I need to tell you something, and I find I can no longer keep myself from saying it, regardless of what it might mean for us both." Her heart pounded, hope and fear tangling together in equal measure. "Then tell me," she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken to him once before, at the ball, when he had first tried and failed to voice whatever truth he was carrying. He opened his mouth to speak, and for one breathless moment, Elowen believed he would finally say the words that had been building between them for weeks. But something flickered across his face instead, a shadow of old fear reasserting itself, and he stopped short, his jaw tightening as the walls she had watched him so carefully lower began, once again, to rise. "The year is nearly finished," he said instead, his voice suddenly careful, distant in a way that felt like a physical retreat. "Only a few weeks remain before the terms of our arrangement conclude." The shift in subject felt like cold water, and Elowen felt something inside her chest constrict painfully at the sudden retreat. "Yes," she said carefully, unwilling to let him see how deeply the deflection had wounded her. "I am aware." "What will you do," he asked, "once the year concludes?" The question hung heavy between them, and Elowen found herself uncertain how honestly to answer it. Did he mean to ask because he hoped she would stay, or because he was preparing himself for her departure, already building distance in advance of a loss he expected to be inevitable? "I have not yet decided," she said finally, choosing caution over vulnerability, unwilling to lay her heart entirely bare when he himself had just retreated so visibly from whatever confession had nearly escaped him. "What of you, Julian? What do you hope will happen once the year concludes?" He looked at her for a long moment, something desperate and conflicted warring behind his eyes, and Elowen thought, once again, that he might finally say the words neither of them had yet dared to speak aloud. But the moment passed, unresolved, as it had at the ball, as it had so many times before, and he simply shook his head, offering no answer at all. "It grows late," he said instead, echoing words he had spoken to her once before in this very room, though the warmth that had once accompanied them now felt strangely, painfully absent. "You should rest, Iluin." She left the library that night with her heart heavy, uncertain what exactly she had witnessed, whether it had been fear holding him back, or simply the discovery that whatever he felt for her did not run as deep as she had allowed herself to hope. Whatever the truth, one fact remained inescapable, hovering over every remaining day of their arrangement like a shadow neither of them could quite outrun. The year was ending, and neither of them, for all their newfound closeness, had yet found the courage to say plainly what they wanted to happen when it finally did. In the days that followed, Elowen found herself watching Julian more closely than ever, searching for some sign, some hint of what truly lay behind his sudden retreat in the library. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on her a beat too long across the dinner table, the way his hand seemed to find hers more often than strict necessity required, small contradictions to the careful distance he had reimposed since that unfinished conversation. It was as though some part of him wanted desperately to close the gap between them, while another part, older and more deeply wounded, remained convinced that reaching for happiness only invited its eventual loss. She thought often of Edmund, of the grief Julian had carried alone for so many years, and began to understand, with growing clarity, that his hesitation was not born of indifference toward her at all, but of fear. He had loved before, deeply, and lost that love to circumstances entirely beyond his control. Perhaps, she realized, he could not yet bring himself to risk loving again, not fully, not when the ending of their year loomed so close and so certain. Determined not to let fear alone decide the fate of whatever they had built together, Elowen resolved to be patient a little longer, to give him the space he seemed to need while quietly, steadily, continuing to show him through every small act of loyalty and care, exactly what she hoped he might eventually find the courage to claim. Whatever happened when the year finally ended, she would not spend these final weeks in silence, watching something precious slip away, without at least trying to hold on to it with both hands. She began, in small ways, to prepare herself for whatever conversation still needed to happen between them. She thought carefully about what she wanted to say, how she might finally break through the last of his defenses without frightening him further into retreat. She had faced her father's ruin with steady resolve, had stood her ground against Insto's cruelty without flinching, had helped uncover a forgery that might have destroyed everything Julian held dear. She would not now allow her own courage to fail her simply because the stakes had become personal rather than practical. One quiet afternoon, walking together through the restored gardens, Julian paused beside a bed of late-blooming roses, the very ones Elowen had coaxed back to life during her first weeks at Harrowgate Hall. He touched one of the blooms gently, his expression thoughtful and far away. "Edmund loved this garden," he said softly, the admission unprompted, unguarded in a way that surprised her. He used to say a garden left untended was simply a garden waiting for someone patient enough to remind it how to grow again. "He sounds as though he understood a great deal," Elowen said gently. He did. Julian's eyes met hers, something fragile and searching in his expression. "I think he would have liked you very much, Elowen. I think he would have told me, in that easy way he had of saying difficult things plainly, that I would be a fool to let you go." The words settled between them, weighted with everything still unspoken, and Elowen found herself holding perfectly still, afraid that any movement might scatter whatever fragile honesty had finally begun to surface. But Julian only smiled, small and sad and achingly gentle, before continuing their walk in silence, leaving her once again with more questions than answers about what truly waited for them both on the other side of this ending year. The final weeks of the year passed with an aching tenderness neither of them spoke of directly, both of them aware, without ever saying so aloud, that the sand in their hourglass had nearly run its course. Elowen found herself memorizing small details of her days at Harrowgate Hall, with a deliberate care she had never before applied to the passage of ordinary time. The particular slant of morning light across the breakfast table, the sound of Julian's footsteps in the corridor outside her door, the quiet, steady rhythm of a life she had never expected to love so completely. Julian, for his part, grew quieter as the year's end approached, retreating into himself in ways that reminded Elowen painfully of the cold stranger she had first married. She told herself it was simply the natural anxiety of uncertain endings, though some deeper part of her feared it meant something else entirely, that he was already withdrawing in preparation for a loss he considered inevitable. The papers arrived on the desk in Julian's study exactly 1 year to the day since their wedding, a neat stack tied with ribbon, drawn up by his solicitor with the same careful precision that had defined every aspect of their original arrangement. Elowen stood in the doorway, watching him stare at them for a long moment before he finally looked up, his face unreadable. "The annulment papers," he said quietly. "As agreed." Something cold settled in Elowen's chest at the sight of them, at the sound of his flat, careful voice, so reminiscent of the stranger who had first stood in her father's drawing room a year ago and offered her a transaction instead of a marriage. Whatever had grown between them these past months, whatever warmth and closeness and unspoken longing had built in the quiet hours they had shared, it seemed, in this moment, to mean nothing against the cold weight of a legal document. "I see," she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "You are free to leave whenever you wish," Julian continued, his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, unable, it seemed, to meet her gaze directly. "The settlement has already been arranged. You will want for nothing." The clinical precision of his words struck her like a physical blow, and Elowen felt something inside her chest crack under the weight of disappointment she had not fully allowed herself to anticipate. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that when this moment finally arrived, he would find some way to ask her to stay. Instead, he stood before her offering nothing but efficient dismissal, exactly as he had promised on the very first day they met. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely steady, "for honoring the terms of our agreement." She turned and left the study before he could see the tears threatening to spill, before he could witness how thoroughly his careful, businesslike retreat had wounded her. She spent the remainder of that day in a haze of quiet grief, instructing her maid to begin packing her belongings, moving through the familiar rooms of Harrogate Hall, with the strange, hollow sensation of saying goodbye to something she had never quite allowed herself to call home, though it had become exactly that over these past 12 months. Mrs. Whitfield found her that evening in the gardens, standing among the roses she had restored with her own hands, staring out at the estate she was about to leave behind forever. "You are truly leaving, then," the housekeeper said softly, coming to stand beside her. "The year is finished," Elowen said, unable to keep the ache from her voice. "There is nothing left to stay for." Mrs. Whitfield's expression turned sharp with something like frustration. "Forgive my boldness, my lady, but I do not believe that is entirely true. I have watched that man for 15 years. I have never once seen him look at another living soul the way he looks at you." "Then why has he said nothing?" Elowen's voice cracked despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Why hand me annulment papers instead of any word of what he actually wants?" "Because he is afraid," Mrs. Whitfield said simply. "He has lost every person he has ever truly loved, my lady. His mother, when he was young. His brother, in that terrible accident. His father's approval, long before his father's death. He has learned, through bitter experience, that loving something deeply only guarantees the pain of eventually losing it. I do not believe his silence today was indifference. I believe it was fear wearing the mask of composure, exactly as it always has with him." Elowen absorbed the housekeeper's words slowly, feeling something shift within her own chest, understanding finally crystallizing where confusion and hurt had reigned only moments before. She thought of everything Julian had shared with her over these past months, the raw grief beside the fire, the fierce, unguarded defense of her honor at the ball, the desperate half-confession in the library that he had twice failed to complete. Every piece fit together now into a portrait not of indifference, but of a man so terrified of loss that he had convinced himself letting her go before she could leave him was somehow safer than risking the alternative. "I cannot force him to overcome a fear that deep," Elowen said quietly. "No," Mrs. Whitfield agreed, "but perhaps you might give him one final reason to try." The following morning arrived gray and overcast, fitting weather, Elowen thought, for the day she would finally leave Harrogate Hall behind. Her trunks were loaded onto the waiting carriage by mid-morning. The household staff gathered in the entrance hall to bid her farewell, with genuine sorrow evident on many of their faces. Julian was notably absent from the gathering, having retreated, as he so often did in moments of difficulty, to the solitary confines of his study. Elowen embraced Mrs. Whitfield warmly, unable to keep her own tears from falling as she said her final goodbyes to the woman who had become, over these past months, something close to a true friend. Then, steadying herself with every ounce of composure she possessed, she climbed into the waiting carriage and gave the order to depart. The carriage had barely begun moving down the long gravel drive when a sound reached her, distant at first, then rapidly growing closer. She turned toward the window and saw, to her utter astonishment, Julian running across the grounds toward the departing carriage, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned, his coat unbuttoned, his hair disheveled from the wind, calling out for the driver to stop. Her heart pounding, Elowen ordered the carriage halted. and stepped down just as Julian reached her, breathless, his chest heaving from the desperate sprint across the estate. "Julian," she said, uncertain what to make of this sudden, unprecedented display of open emotion from a man who had spent his entire life carefully guarding against exactly this kind of vulnerability. "What are you doing?" "Stopping you," he said, still catching his breath. "Before you leave, before I lose the last chance I have to say what I should have said yesterday, and every day before that, if I had possessed even half the courage you have shown me since the day we first met." Elowen's breath caught, hope rising fierce and fragile in her chest, despite every instinct warning her not to trust it too quickly. "Then say it now," she said softly. Julian stepped closer, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stripped away every last trace of the cold, distant man who had once offered her a transaction instead of a marriage. "I do not want an annulment," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "I have not wanted one for months, if I am entirely honest, though I convinced myself yesterday that offering it to you was somehow the right thing to do, the honorable thing, releasing you from an obligation I feared you might otherwise feel trapped by." "Julian, let me finish," he said, and something in his desperate urgency stopped whatever protest she had been about to offer. "I fell in love with you the week you arrived at Harrogate Hall, Elowen, though I did not have the courage to admit it, not even to myself, until it was already far too late to pretend otherwise. I fell in love with your defiance, your refusal to be invisible in a house that had forgotten what warmth even meant. I fell in love with the way you handled Insto without ever once flinching, the way you sat with me beside the fire and did not run from my grief, the way you fought for this family, for me, when you owed me nothing beyond the barest terms of our original agreement." Tears spilled freely down Elowen's cheeks now, and she made no effort to stop them. "Then why did you say nothing yesterday?" "Because I am a coward," Julian said simply, the admission clearly costing him something deep and difficult. "I have lost everyone I have ever truly loved, Elowen. My mother, my brother, even my father's regard, long before his actual death. I convinced myself that letting you go before you could choose to leave me was somehow less painful than the alternative. I was wrong. I have never in my life been more wrong about anything." Elowen closed the remaining distance between them, reaching up to press her palm gently against his cheek, feeling him lean into the touch with something like relief. "I am not your mother, Julian. I am not Edmund. I am not going anywhere, unless you truly wish me to." "I do not wish it," he said fiercely, his hand covering hers against his cheek. "I wish for precisely the opposite. I wish for you to stay, not because a contract requires it, not because duty demands it, but because I cannot imagine this house, or this life, or any version of my future that does not include you standing beside me exactly as you have these past months." "Then ask me properly," Elowen said, a small, trembling smile breaking through her tears. "Not as a transaction this time." Julian's answering smile was the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, transforming his entire face into something warm and achingly beautiful. He took her hands in both of his, dropping to one knee right there on the gravel drive, heedless of the damp ground or the small audience of household staff who had gathered at a respectful distance to witness the scene unfolding before them. "Elowen Ashcombe," he said, his voice steady now, certain in a way she had never once heard from him before. "Will you stay with me? Not for 1 year, not for any contract or convenient arrangement, but for the rest of our lives, because I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I cannot imagine facing whatever remains of my future without you beside me?" "Yes," Elowen said, laughing through her tears, pulling him up and into an embrace that neither of them seemed inclined to break any time soon. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, right there in the middle of the drive, warm and certain and utterly unlike the cold, distant stranger who had once offered her nothing more than a practical solution to a practical problem. Around them, the assembled staff broke into spontaneous applause, and Elowen caught sight of Mrs. Whitfield dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron, a wide, unguarded smile transforming her usually composed features. They renewed their vows 3 weeks later, in the very chapel where their original wedding had taken place, though this ceremony bore no resemblance to the cold, hurried formality of the first. The chapel overflowed with flowers from the gardens Elowen had restored, the pews filled with genuine friends rather than reluctant strangers, and when Julian spoke his vows this time, his voice rang clear and steady through the chapel, every word carrying the weight of a promise made not from necessity, but from love, freely, joyfully chosen. Elowen's family attended, her sisters weeping happily throughout the ceremony, her father beaming with a pride and relief that had nothing left to do with settled debts and everything to do with watching his daughter find genuine happiness where he had once feared only sacrifice would exist. Even Mrs. Whitfield stood among the witnesses, her earlier prediction fulfilled entirely. The laughter she had once promised Harrogate Hall could hold again, now filling every corner of the ancient stone walls. As the ceremony concluded and Julian finally, properly kissed his bride before a room full of witnesses who genuinely celebrated their union, Elowen felt the last remnants of the frightened, uncertain girl who had once agreed to a stranger's cold bargain finally settle into something whole and certain and deeply, permanently happy. What had begun as a transaction, a desperate solution to an impossible problem, had become, against every reasonable expectation either of them had carried into that first cold meeting, a love neither of them had dared to hope for, but both of them, in the end, had been brave enough to claim. Harrogate Hall, once a house of silence and careful, guarded distance, rang now with laughter, with warmth, with the easy comfort of two people who had found, in each other, exactly what neither had known they were searching for. And as the newly renewed Duke and Duchess of Harrogate stood together in the chapel doorway, watching sunlight break through clouds that had threatened rain all morning, Elowen understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face every one of them together, bound not by contract or convenience, but by a love strong enough to outlast every fear either of them had once carried. In the months that followed, Harrogate Hall continued its slow, steady transformation, the gardens flourishing further with each passing season, the once empty rooms filling gradually with the sounds of visiting family and genuine friends. Julian, freed at last from the weight of guilt and fear he had carried for so many years, became known throughout the county as a man of surprising warmth. His rare, easy laughter, now a regular feature of a household that had once known only silence. Elowen's sisters visited often, delighting in the transformation of both the estate and the sister they had once feared might disappear into a cold, loveless arrangement for their sake. Margaret, in particular, took great pleasure in reminding Elowen, with the smug satisfaction only a younger sibling could manage, that she had suspected all along the Duke's frightening exterior concealed something far softer underneath. Mrs. Whitfield remained at Harrogate Hall for many years afterward, proudly claiming a small but genuine part in the love story that had unfolded within the walls she had faithfully tended for decades. She often told the story, to any new member of staff willing to listen, of the day the Duchess had first arrived, quiet and composed despite her obvious fear, and had somehow, through nothing more than patience and unwavering courage, taught a broken house and its broken master how to hope again. Julian never again spoke of Edmund with the raw, guarded grief that had once defined every mention of his brother's name. Instead, he spoke of him warmly, easily, sharing stories with Elowen, and later with their own children, of a young man whose laughter had once filled these very halls, keeping his memory alive not through silence and closed doors, but through the very warmth and openness Elowen had helped restore to the house he had loved. What had begun as a desperate bargain between two strangers, born from ruin on one side and obligation on the other, had grown, through patience and honesty and the slow, steady accumulation of small, unguarded moments, into something neither of them could have imagined possible on that first cold day in a London drawing room. It became, quite simply, a love story, the kind neither of them had believed themselves entitled to hope for, and the kind that neither of them, in the end, ever took for granted again. 2 years into their true marriage, Elowen woke one morning with a strange, unfamiliar heaviness in her stomach, and by the time the physician arrived that afternoon, summoned by a worried Mrs. Whitfield, the news he delivered sent the entire household into a flurry of quiet, joyful chaos. Elowen was carrying a child. Julian's reaction, when she told him that evening in the privacy of their bedchamber, was not the immediate joy she had expected. Instead, she watched something complicated cross his face, joy tangled tightly with a fear so old and familiar she recognized it instantly. "Julian," she said gently, taking his hand, "what troubles you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands rather than meeting her eyes. "My mother," he said finally, "died bringing Edmund into the world. I was young, but I remember the fear in this house afterward, the way my father never quite forgave the world for taking her, though he never said so plainly." Understanding dawned, and Elowen felt her heart ache for the boy he had once been, forced to carry such fear alongside his grief for so many years. "Julian, that was a different time, different circumstances. I am strong and healthy, and the physician has assured me there is no reason for undue concern." "I know," he said, though his voice remained unsteady. "I know it with my mind. But some fears do not answer to reason, Elowen. I have already lost so much to circumstances I could not control. I do not know if I can survive losing you as well." She pulled him close, resting her head against his chest, feeling his heart pound rapidly beneath her ear. "You will not lose me," she said firmly. "I intend to grow old in this house with you, watching our children grow, watching the gardens bloom season after season for many years to come. I have no intention of letting fear write our story for us, not after everything we fought to build together." Word of the coming child spread quickly through the county, and well wishes poured in from neighbors and acquaintances who had watched, over the preceding years, the remarkable transformation of both Harrogate Hall and its once forbidding master. Even those who had originally whispered doubts about the hasty, practical nature of the Duke's marriage now spoke openly of the couple as one of the season's great love stories, their journey from cold arrangement to genuine devotion having become something of a favorite tale among the local gentry. Elowen found herself, in quiet moments during those early months of waiting, reflecting often on how far they had both traveled since that first rain-soaked afternoon in her father's drawing room. She thought of the frightened, practical young woman who had agreed to marry a stranger out of necessity, never once imagining that such a cold beginning might grow into a marriage overflowing with genuine warmth and anticipation. She thought, too, of the guarded, grieving man who had offered her nothing more than businesslike terms, never imagining he might one day tremble with joy and fear in equal measure at the prospect of becoming a father. Over the following months, Julian's fear did not entirely disappear, but he fought it with a determination Elowen had come to recognize as fundamental to who he truly was beneath every careful wall he had once built. He accompanied her to every visit with the physician, asked careful, thorough questions, and slowly, steadily, allowed himself to feel excitement alongside the fear, rather than letting the fear consume every other emotion entirely. As her time grew near, the household settled into a state of anxious anticipation, Mrs. Whitfield fussing over preparations with the same careful thoroughness she had once applied to Elowen's earliest days at Harrogate Hall. Margaret came to stay for the final weeks, insisting she would not miss the arrival of her first niece or nephew for anything in the world, her cheerful presence a welcome distraction from the growing nervousness that had settled over the entire house. The labor, when it finally began on a crisp autumn evening, stretched long into the night, and Julian, banished from the room by tradition and the physician's firm insistence, paced the length of the corridor outside with an intensity that alarmed even the household staff accustomed to his more measured temperament. Mrs. Whitfield eventually found him sitting on the floor outside the bedchamber door, his head in his hands, and sat beside him without a word, offering silent companionship through the longest hours of his life. "She is strong," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, somewhere past midnight, when his composure had worn thin enough that he finally spoke his fears aloud. "Stronger than anyone I have known in all my years at Harrogate Hall. She faced you down on her very first evening here, Your Grace, cold and frightening as you were determined to be. She faced Insto without flinching. She faced a forged letter that might have destroyed everything you held dear, and found the proof needed to expose it. This is simply one more thing she will face and overcome, because that is who she is." Julian said nothing, but something in his shoulders eased slightly at the housekeeper's steady confidence, and he continued his vigil with a fraction more hope than fear. When the child's cry finally split the night air, thin and furious and utterly perfect, Julian was on his feet before the sound had even fully registered, pushing past the physician's assistant with a desperation that brooked no argument. He found Elowen exhausted but radiant, cradling a small, red-faced bundle against her chest, and the sight of them together undid every careful wall he had ever built around his own heart. "A daughter," Elowen said softly, looking up at him with exhausted, joyful eyes. "Julian, we have a daughter." He crossed the room and sank to his knees beside the bed, reaching out with trembling hands to touch his daughter's impossibly small fingers, tears he made no effort to hide slipping freely down his face. "She is perfect," he whispered, "absolutely perfect." "What shall we name her?" Elowen asked, watching him with a tenderness that had only deepened in the years since their reunion on the gravel drive. Julian considered the question seriously, his eyes never leaving his daughter's tiny, sleeping face. "Edith," he said finally. "After my mother, I think it is time this house remembered her with joy rather than only with sorrow." "Edith," Elowen repeated softly, testing the name, watching it settle warmly into the space between them. "It suits her." In the weeks that followed, Harrogate Hall filled with a new kind of joy entirely, the quiet, exhausted happiness of new parents learning the rhythms of a small, demanding, thoroughly beloved addition to their family. Julian, to the quiet astonishment of everyone who had once known him only as the cold, distant Duke, proved himself a devoted father, spending hours each evening simply holding his daughter by the fire, telling her stories of the uncle she would never meet, but whose warmth, he promised her, still lived on in every corner of this restored happy house. Margaret, delighted beyond measure by her new role as an aunt, extended her visit by several additional weeks, and Elowen's father made the journey from London, specifically to meet his first grandchild, weeping openly at the sight of his daughter surrounded by such evident happiness and security, a stark, welcome contrast to the desperate fear that had once driven her into this marriage in the first place. Watching Julian one quiet evening, seated by the nursery fire with Edith sleeping soundly against his chest, Elowen felt the last remaining traces of the fear that had once shadowed their earliest days together finally, completely dissolve. The man who had once offered her a cold transaction in exchange for her family's survival had become, through patience and courage and a willingness to face down his own deepest fears, exactly the kind of husband and father she had never quite allowed herself to dream of finding. "You are staring again," Julian murmured, not looking up from his daughter's sleeping face, a smile evident in his voice despite his quiet tone. "I am simply admiring the view," Elowen said, crossing the room to settle beside him, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep together in the firelight. "I used to believe," Julian said softly, "that happiness like this was not meant for men like me, that I had somehow forfeited any claim to it, the day I failed to save my brother from the water. And now?" He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with an emotion so far removed from the cold, guarded stranger she had first married, that Elowen sometimes still marveled at the transformation. "Now I understand that happiness was never something to be earned through some impossible standard of guilt or worthiness," he said. "It was simply waiting, patiently, for someone brave enough to walk through my door and refuse to leave, no matter how determined I was to keep her at a distance." Elowen smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his shoulder. "I have never been very good at leaving things I care about behind," she said. "You should know that about me by now, Your Grace." "I am beginning to understand it quite thoroughly," Julian said, his voice warm with a happiness that had, over these past years, become as natural to him as breathing, and I find myself endlessly grateful for it, every single day. Outside, the autumn wind moved gently through the restored gardens of Harrogate Hall, rustling through roses that had once stood neglected and forgotten, now flourishing season after season under careful, devoted attention. Inside, by the warm glow of the nursery fire, a family that had begun as nothing more than a desperate bargain between two strangers settled into the quiet, unshakable contentment of a love that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the truest and most permanent thing either of them had ever known. Years later, when their daughter had grown old enough to ask about the portrait of the smiling young man that still hung above the drawing-room mantel, Julian would kneel beside her and tell the story of his brother Edmund, with warmth rather than sorrow, describing his laughter, his kindness, his love of the very gardens Edith now played in each summer afternoon. He would tell her too, though in gentler terms suited to a child's understanding, of a difficult year long ago when he had nearly let fear cost him everything that mattered most, and of the brave, steady woman who had refused to let him. Elowen, listening from the doorway on such evenings, never tired of watching the man she had once married as a stranger become, so completely and so naturally, the very heart of the family they had built together. Whatever fears had once kept him locked behind careful walls of ice and distance, they had long since melted away entirely, replaced by a warmth that filled every corner of Harrogate Hall, season after season, year after year, exactly as she had once quietly hoped it might, on that very first lonely night she had spent within its cold stone walls.